History this week, we're going to talk about chili, Ned Kelly, potatoes, Brazil, Russia, Korea, the Oregon Trial, China's Boxer Rebellion, and the Balkan Mess. I can't wait to see what you guys can remember. So in South America, Chile and Bolivia fought about who owned the hottest desert in the world. This desert didn't have any water or life, but it had a lot of very expensive chemicals and minerals. Copper, saltpeter, and sodium nitrate. Saltpeter was made in gunpowder, and sodium nitrate was used to make fertilizer and bombs. So when they went to the desert to mine these things, the Chileans, the Bolivians was like, no, this is our desert. And eventually it started a big war, and because Bolivia and Peru signed a treaty, Peru joined Bolivia in the war against Chile. So it was Peru and Bolivia against Chile. But unfortunately for them, they couldn't fight in the hot desert, so they had to fight in the ocean. And Chile had the strongest navies in South America, and Bolivia had no navy at all. And all that Peru had was 2 iron warships. They lost the first one right from the beginning when it scraped on a coral reef, and the second one gave a good fight, but eventually Chile got it and could use it for themselves. Then Chile went into Peru, and the president fled from the country, and the Chilean soldiers invaded Lima and making it burn to the ground. Yet Peru refused to surrender for 3 more years and eventually signed a peace treaty that gave the southern part of the coastline to Chile, and Bolivia also had to give up land, its entire coastline. From that day on, Bolivia was landlocked. It had no way to get to the sea, and Chile had won the right to Atacama Desert and all of its mines. In 2004, can you believe, more than 100 years after the War of the Pacific had ended, the president of Bolivia was still insisting that Chile and Bolivia should talk about who really owned the land along the sea. So, way back then in the late 1800s, Australia wasn't really a country yet. It was more of a jail. So what the British Empire did was they sent all their prisoners there, and eventually these prisoners planted fields and built houses and grew food. And at first they struggled, but eventually they got used to it and they started to actually farm stuff. And because of this, other people from Britain decided they also wanted to move to Australia. And then when gold was discovered in Australia, thousands of gold miners came over from all over the world. And people became very rich. But unfortunately, rich men with gold and power took the best land of Australia, and poor working farmers often had to survive with tiny, dry patches of ground. And many Australians believed that the government officials and police didn't care much about the rights of the poorest sheep farmers and cattle herders. And they started bush wrangling. The most famous bush wrangler of all was Ned Kelly. He had a troubled life. He was in and out of jail, and the police even accused him of things that many people say he never did. And for 2 years, him and his brother went and robbed banks and hid from the police. But many of the poor Australians thought Ned Kelly and his gangs were heroes because they fought back against the cruel and unjust police and government officials. And Nelly and his gang were prepared for a shootout the one night. They had made themselves iron armor out of plough pots. Each suit of armor weighed 50 pounds or more and would stop a bullet. They literally dressed themselves in a suit of iron armor, okay? But Ned Kelly didn't have any armor on his legs, and during the gun battle he was shot in the legs, and he collapsed while he was trying to save his brother and the rest of the gang. The outlaws were killed except for Ned, and he was captured by the police and taken to Melbourne for accused of murder. Okay? During his trial, Ned Kelly claimed that he had always fought only to defend himself, and he told the judge, "I am the last man in the world who would take a man's life." And when the judge said, "You are accusing the witnesses against you of lying," Ned Kelly answered, "I dare say, but a day will come at a bigger court than this, when we shall see who is right and who is wrong." And Ned Kelly was sentenced to death. Okay, 30,000 Australians signed a petition asking the governor of Melbourne to save Ned Kelly from death, but the governor refused and he died. For 100 years, Australians wrote stories and poems about Ned Kelly. Some Australians insisted that Ned Kelly was just a common criminal. For 100 years, Australians wrote stories and poems about Ned Kelly. Some Australians insisted that Ned Kelly was just a common criminal, but others believed that Kelly was a brave man fighting against the unjust law that Great Britain forced Australians to obey. 21 years after Ned Kelly's death, Australia became the Commonwealth of Australia. Like Canada, Australia would remain part of the British Empire, but the Australians would have the right to make their own laws and elect their own leaders. In Ireland, in 1848, reports of a strange new problem was beginning to spread across Europe. Potato plants in Holland had begun to blacken and wither. Beneath the stems, potatoes were rotting in the ground. Soon, potato plants in France and Britain were rotting too, and the farmers of Ireland called this potato rot the blight. Now remember, the Irish was part of the British Empire, right? And the Irish farmed for British, and they sent all their other food to Britain and kept the potatoes for themselves. So the only thing the Irish was allowed to eat was potatoes, nothing else. Only the potatoes remained in Ireland. And if the potatoes rotted, the Irish would have very little to eat. And then one day, the blight came to Ireland. And the potato crop failed the following year and the year after that, and people in Ireland began to die of hunger in the hundreds, and then in the thousands, and then in the hundreds of thousands, guys. But in England, the English Parliament didn't believe that the Irish was really starving. After all, the Irish was always making a big fuss over nothing. But not all of the Englishmen ignored the plight of Ireland. The Prime Minister of England, Robert Peel, knew that something had to be done. But he couldn't. There was a problem. There was a corn law that said that they cannot buy food from other places and give it to Ireland because there will be a huge tax on it. So he thought that maybe famine would be a good reason to get rid of the corn law. But the Parliament refused, and eventually they said that the members of the Parliament said that Ireland must stand alone and work out his problems. And he appealed, and he reappealed, and he repealed, and then at last he won the fight, and the Parliament agreed to get rid of the tax. But then he lost his position as the Prime Minister because he helped Ireland, and that made him very unpopular. And then Only 5 years later, the farmers began to see healthy potatoes in their fields, and in 1850 the blight was over. But Ireland was changed forever. More than 1 million Irish were dead. Another million had left their homes and gone to another country. Over 800,000 had gone to the United States. In Ireland itself, hatred of English rule had grown even stronger. More and more Irish began demanding the right of home rule and the right to make their own laws. And for years the debates went on. And in 1886, the Prime Minister of Britain, William Gladstone, finally asked the Parliament to vote on a law that would give Ireland home rule. But they did not. When the Home Rule Bill came up before the Parliament, the members of the Parliament voted against it. Great Britain had chosen a terrible road. That decision would lead to 100 years of chaos, unrest, and a violent Ireland. Brazil had been ruled by only 2 emperors in the short history. The first emperor of Brazil, Pedro I, was the son of the King of Portugal. When Pedro was a little boy, Brazil wasn't even a country. It was a Portuguese colony. Pedro grew up in the colony of Brazil. When he was 23, his father, the King of Portugal, gave him the job of governing Brazil. A year later, Pedro led Brazil in declaring independence from Portugal and from his father. He became Pedro I, the first emperor of an independent Brazil. Pedro managed to rule this restless country for nearly 9 years before riots broke out. Before riots broke out in the streets of Brazil's capital city, Rio de Janeiro. Unhappy Brazilians yelled that Pedro I was still too loyal to Portugal and that he wasn't giving his people enough freedom. Pedro I collected his money, his belongings, and most of his family, caught a British warship in the port, and sailed away. He's like, okay, fine, I'm leaving. But he left his ministers of state and also his 5-year-old son. The little boy had a name bigger than he was. Pedro de Alcantara, José Carlo Leopoldo Salvador Bibiano Francisco Xavier de Paula Leocadio Miguel Rafael Gabriela Gonzaga, by the grace of God and unanimous acclamation of the people, constitutional emperor and perpetual defender of Brazil. Wow, what a mouthful. But for short, they called him Pedro II. At 5, Pedro II wasn't exactly ready to be the constitutional emperor and the perpetual defender of Brazil. So 3 of his father's ministers formed a committee to help him rule until he was older. In 1841, at the age of 15, Pedro II took control of his country. Pedro II believed that Brazil could only prosper if all groups of the people had the opportunity to work, to earn a good living, and to get an education. He encouraged Brazilian companies to build modern factories. He started new schools. He made sure that his country became educated. But most of all, Pedro II set out to get rid of slavery. He was a great admirer of the American president Abraham Lincoln, and even his father called slavery cancer. Slavery would have to go. But many of the powerful plantation owners in Brazil used slaves to run their farms and harvest their crops. They weren't willing to give up their free help. So Pedro II had to get rid of slavery very slowly. 9 years into his reign, he made slave trade to Brazil illegal. No more slaves could be brought into Brazil. Then 21 years later, he declared that all the Brazilian slaves were free. And 17 years after that, the government signed a law making slavery illegal. By 1888, Pedro II had been the Emperor of Brazil for 47 long years. During most of his reign, he had been popular. The people of Brazil were more prosperous than ever when he had even taken the throne. Pedro's new schools had also done their jobs. More men and women had learned how to read and write in Brazil than any other country in the world. In 1889, the year after slavery was made illegal, Pedro II realized that he would not be able to keep his throne any longer. He was now 62 years old. He had spent his life working to make Brazil a rich, free, well-educated modern country, a modern country that no longer wanted to be ruled by an old-fashioned emperor. Late one evening, Pedro II called the Council of State together. He asked, should he stay in Brazil or keep his crown? They agreed that he should not stay, that he should leave, and that Brazil needed to be a republic with a constitution of their own. So Pedro said, okay, fine, I'm leaving, and I'm leaving now. And he immediately collected his family and sailed from Brazil, heading for the city of Paris. 2 years later, the old emperor caught the flu. He died a few days before Christmas in the year 1891. Brazil had just finished writing its new constitution when Pedro II was buried in Portugal. They brought his body back to Brazil and buried it in a place of honor. He had become a Brazilian hero, even though the age of emperors was gone. In 1889, the Tsar of Russia was Alexander III of the royal Romanov family. He had inherited the throne of Russia from his father, Alexander II. Alexander II tried to make Russia a little bit more Western and a little bit more modern. He built railroads and new schools. He gave the towns of Russia permission to govern themselves, and he also attacked the Turkish Empire and took Turkish land away. But only 3 years after the Russian victory over Turks, Alexander II was killed by 2 assassins who threw a bomb into his horse-drawn carriage as he was being driven through the streets of St. Petersburg. Alexander III became Tsar in his father's place. He was 36 years old, a huge man, 6'4", with wide shoulders and a big dark beard. He had seen his father killed by his own people, and for his entire reign Alexander III was afraid that he would also be assassinated. So he set out to undo everything that his father did. Cancelled Alexander II's decree that towns could govern themselves. He took away the new freedoms of the Russian people, and the poor people suffered. Under the rule of Alexander III, the noblemen had privileges, riches, and power, but the poor people of Russia were wretched. To the peasants, farmers, workers of Russia, Alexander III was a cruel tyrant. Alexander III had been Tsar for 7 years when assassins tried to kill him, just like his father. He was riding in the royal rail coach with his family when a bomb went off underneath the tracks. The railroad coach lurched off the rails, tottered and fell, the roof collapsing inward and the windows shattering. For a moment, nothing moved in the wreckage, and then the crumpled roof shuddered and began to rise. Alexander's huge figure rose out of the ruined coach. His wide shoulders braced against the roof. He held it up until his family could crawl out from beneath the twisted metal. Not a single person was killed, but doctors think that the bruises and the strain of lifting the roof damaged Alexander's body. He was Tsar for 6 more years, but he grew slowly weaker and sicker. When he died in 1894, he left behind him a Russia filled with poor, starving peasants, proud, overbearing noblemen, and unhappy workers. His son Nicholas II inherited the throne and a country of discontent subjects. How would Nicholas II deal with his troubled Russia? He had no idea. When he learned of his father's death, Nicholas grew pale. "What will I do?" he said to the messenger who brought the news. "I am not prepared to be a Tsar. I know nothing about the business of ruling." Maybe Nicholas II wasn't prepared to be the Tsar, but he had no choice. He shouldered the job of ruling Russia. The next war of the modern age exploded between the vast country of China and Japan just off China's eastern coast. Although China was much bigger than Japan, Japan had been growing steadily stronger and the Qing dynasty of China had been growing weaker and weaker. In 1894, Japan challenged China's power and a war began. But the war wasn't fought in Japan or China, it was fought in Korea. The little country of Korea lay between the two hostile neighbors on a peninsula that jutted down from the Chinese province of Manchuria into the Sea of Japan. The king of Korea, King Kojong, ruled with the help of his wife, Queen Min. As a matter of fact, many people thought that Queen Min was the real ruler of Korea. Kojong, the 26th king of the royal Joseon dynasty of Korea, became king when he was only 11 years old. When he was 14, he was told it was time for him to get married. And like always, he did what he was told. He got married to Min, and Min wasn't like Kojong. She was strong-willed, intelligent, and she was much more ambitious than her husband. Min didn't like the regent who was ruling for King Kojong. She didn't like the way he treated her husband, and she didn't like his ideas about the country. For many years, Korea had treated China as an older brother, and Korea traded only with China, not any other country. But Min, along with any other Korean, thought that the time had come to Korea to start trading with other countries, especially with Japan. When she was 22, Min convinced her husband that it was time for him to take power. The region had no choice but to step down, and King Joyong had now ruled in his own name, but Queen Min was the most powerful leader in the palace. Very soon, King Kojong and Queen Min signed a trade treaty with Japan so that Japanese ships dock at 3 Korean ports to buy Korean iron and coal. But Korea also wanted to remain friends with China. So China and Japan made a deal with each other. Since neither country wanted the other to take control of Korea, they agreed that Korea would be protected by both China and Japan, and that neither Japan nor China would send soldiers into Korea without the agreement of the other country. For a little while this agreement seemed to work, but in 1894 King Kojong was faced with a problem. A new religious group called the Tongka in the south of Korea started collecting weapons and planned a rebellion. He sent a message to China asking for help. The Qing emperor agreed. China borrowed a British warship, loaded soldiers onto it, and sent it into the ocean to sail towards Korea. The Japanese thought that they were going to invade Korea, so they shot the ship down, and this meant war. By August 1st, 1894, China had declared war on Japan. Can you believe it? Over such a big or small misunderstanding. But the war wasn't in China or in Japan, they fought in Korea. China's army turned out to be no match for Japan's modern soldiers armed with Western weapons. In less than 8 months, Japan had marched from South Korea up into China itself. China had to agree to sign the peace treaty and give Korea total independence from China, and also give Japanese large territories once held by China. Many other countries also started taking pieces of China. But what about Korea? Although Korea was now completely independent from China, there were plenty of Japanese soldiers still occupying Korea. But Queen Min was worried. She doubted that Korea would remain free. She feared Japan would seize her country and rule over it. So she sent a message to Russia, asking to be an ally against both China and Japan. Japanese spies found the message and they sent a message to Japan, and assassins came and killed Queen Min. 15 years after Queen Min died, Japan made Korea part of the Japanese Empire. Queen Min's fears became true. Korea had lost its independence and Japan had taken over her little country. Late 1800, the people in East United States moved to the West in search for jobs, and this became known as the Oregon Trail. The trip out west took 6 months, and despite the long, hard journey, thousands and thousands of Americans decided to take the Oregon Trail. The US government wanted these American settlers to claim the west of the United States. So as people went west, government officials went with them and divided the huge western lands into areas called territories. But there was a problem. The western territories to which the settlers were traveling weren't empty. Native Americans, nicknamed Indians, had been living there for centuries. At first, the Native Americans were mostly friendly to the settlers, but as more and more pioneers arrived, the Native Americans began to see that this huge invasion would deprive them of their land. They began to defend their villages and their hunting grounds against the newcomers. In response, the US government sent an army, soldiers with guns, to fight against the Native American tribes with their horses, bows, and arrows. Skirmishes and battles were fought all over the West, but the sheer size of the US army eventually drove the Native Americans out of their own lands where they had always lived. Instead, the United States marked off certain areas of land called reservations and told the Native American tribes they could only live in these reserved places. The western part of the United States no longer belonged to the Native Americans. American businessmen built large railroads. Soon the railroad tracks crossed the entire continent, and the American West had changed forever. For many years, European countries, along with the United States, had been trying to creep into China. To fight the invasion of the West, a small group of Chinese rebels formed a secret society called the Boxers. The Boxers planned to begin the war against the foreigners by attacking both missionaries from the West and Chinese Christians. They believed that these Chinese Christians were traitors to their country because they had converted to the Western religion. According to the Boxers, Christian missionaries brought Western ways into China and helped to destroy the traditions of the Chinese. So they attacked all the missionaries. The government of China had done very little to stop the Boxers. The Emperor of China himself refused to approve of the Boxer attacks, but many of his court officials did, and so did his aunt, Cixi. Cixi was the real ruler of China. Her nephew Gangchu had inherited the throne and the title of emperor. But when Gangchu first became emperor, he made himself unpopular very quickly. So Cixi put her nephew on an island in the middle of the palace lake. Now she held the real power in the capital of Beijing. The Boxers roamed through the country, killing missionaries who could not get away from them, burning churches and pulling up railway lines. Pulling up, not putting up, pulling out. Governments from all around the world sent messages to Cixi, ordering her to stop. She agreed. She called up the army and put them on the alert, but she never actually told them to attack. She liked what the Boxers were doing, although she might pretend to obey the Western countries telling her to stop them. She had no intention of actually doing so. As the Boxer rebellion grew larger, many foreigners in China fled to the city of Beijing. The foreigners ran to the embassies and closed the gates of the Legion compounds. The Boxers were marching into Beijing. Instead of stopping the Boxers with the Imperial Army, Cixi let them come in and surround the embassies. She declared that China was at war with the countries of the West. The news of the siege had reached the outside world. Russia, Japan, and the United States, with British and French soldiers, landed on the shore of China and marched towards Beijing. On August 14th in 1900, 2 months after the siege of the legation compound had begun, the army of the foreigners arrived in Beijing. The Western soldiers shot the Boxers down. They broke down the gates of the Forbidden City, where the Chinese government had its headquarters, invaded the city, and burnt the Great Summer Palace. Cixi barely escaped. The government officials who were left in China had to face the victorious French army. They promised that if the soldiers would go back home instead of staying in Beijing, the Boxers would be properly punished. So, Cixi was allowed to return to Beijing as Empress Dowager, but she had to agree that schools would now teach Western ideas, and she had to agree to outlaw several traditional Chinese practices. And she also had to agree to send Chinese officials abroad to study and learn from the constitutions and governments of other countries. The Qing dynasty had survived the Boxer Rebellion. 7 years later, when Cixi died of a stroke, the 3-year-old Prince Pui inherited the throne of China. Now the Boxer Rebellion was over. Russia and Japan was no longer allies. In fact, they were enemies because both of them wanted to grab part of China for themselves. Russia had acquired Port Arthur and started to build a new railroad in China. And Port Arthur and the railroad were both part of Russia's plan for taking over the land in Asia. Japan certainly didn't want to lose Korea or any part of China to Nicholas II. Japan sent his ambassadors to Moscow with a message to Nicholas II. Japan would appreciate it if you would move your soldiers out of Port Arthur. But this respectful sounding message really meant was, don't even think about using those soldiers to invade Korea. Nicholas II refused to remove Russian soldiers in Port Arthur, so Japan called its ambassadors home and told them to take no more messages to the Tsar. This was called breaking off diplomatic relations. A declaration of war was coming. But the Tsar wasn't worried. After all, for centuries Japan had been an old-fashioned, isolated country without a modern army. The Russians were not very afraid of it. Russian officers didn't even tell the battleships and troops of Port Arthur to keep a special watch. If a shot is fired, Nicholas II remarked, the Japanese, not the Russians, will have to fire the first shot. This was a mistake. It was February 9, 1904, just after midnight. The Russian ships lay quietly at anchor at Port Arthur. Off-duty soldiers lay in their bunks, sleeping. The Japanese government had decided to follow a traditional piece of advice often given to the samurai. If your sword is too short, take one step forward. Admiral Togo's spies had told him that the battleships and the forts at Port Arthur were expecting an attack. The spies were very wrong. The Russians were expecting nothing. midnight, the captain of the lead Japanese ship gave the signal to his men of the lead Japanese ship, a, a torpedo flew from the ship's torpedo tubes and slammed into the nearest Russian battleship. On the shores, the Russian officials heard explosions and wondered why the battleships were doing target practice in the middle of the night. For hours, no one on shore even realized that an attack was underway. For 148 days, Japanese ships kept Port Arthur under siege. Finally, the Russian forces at Port Arthur had to surrender. Then, the Japanese marched against the Russian soldiers on land. The Tsar's army was defeated. On May 27, 1904, the rest of the Russian fleet was destroyed by the Japanese fleet, still under the command of Admiral Togo. The war was over and Japan had won. The President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, helped to arrange a peace treaty between the two countries. And in August 1905, the treaty between the two countries was signed in the United States. But for the first time, a European army had been defeated by an Asian country, and it had become clear to the whole world that Japan was a force to be reckoned with. The Balkan mess was a big confusion because until the 1879, much of the Balkan Peninsula belonged to the Ottoman Empire. But after the war between Turks and Russia, the Ottoman Turks had lost some of the land and the Russians won. The Ottoman Empire had to give Romania and most of Asia Minor, called Anatolia at the time, to Russia. It also had to agree to give Bulgaria its freedom. This arrangement made the rest of Europe nervous. It made Russia much larger, and it also turned Bulgaria into a big independent country that will always be a loyal ally of the Russians. Russia was getting far too powerful. So the great powers of Europe, France, Germany, Great Britain, and Austria, told Russia that it could keep Romania, but it had to give Anatolia back to the Turks. They also decided that since Bulgaria would always fight on Russia's side in any war, Bulgaria would have to be smaller. So they forced the newly freed Bulgarians to give the whole southern part of their new country back to Turks as well. But together, the northern and the southern parts of Bulgaria decided to reunite. But the Ottoman Turks, worn out by the war, didn't try to stop them. The Russians became angry that they didn't ask them for permission. But now the Balkan Peninsula had changed. Bulgaria was independent and no longer an ally of Russia. The Turks still controlled Anatolia. Montenegro was still free. Serbia, which had part of the Turks, was also set free. Austria took Bosnia for itself, and now Bosnia and Croatia were both part of Austria. And the Turks got to keep Albania and Macedonia. But a couple of years later, Macedonia tried to break free from the Turks. They rebelled and they declared themselves independent of the Turkish rule. Apparently, the Turks hadn't learned anything from the Bulgarian rebellion, and there was lots of violence and killing. Eventually, the Young Turks took over, but the Balkan countries began to fight for their independence. Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro joined together with the help of the Russian government and tried to free Macedonia from Turkish rule. This First Balkan War began in 1912. In less than 2 months, the weak, disorganized Turkish army realized that it would have to surrender the rest of the Balkan land. But Macedonia never did get its freedom. Instead, the Second Balkan War began between Serbia, Bulgaria, and Greece. These three countries, which had been allies against the Turks, started to argue with each other about how they would divide up Macedonia. In 1913, Bulgarian soldiers attacked their own allies, trying to take away a part of Macedonia by force. The attack failed. Greece and Serbia divided Macedonia up between themselves. Bulgaria only got a tiny piece of land. Now, all of the Balkans were free of the Turks, but the countries on the Balkan Peninsula were furious with each other. Serbia, which had been attacked by Bulgaria over the division of Macedonia, grew more and more hostile to Bulgaria and to Austria, Bulgaria's new friend. On June 28, 1914, a Serbian would show how much Serbia hated both Bulgaria and Austria. He would kill the heir to the throne of Austria, and this would not begin the Third Balkan War. Instead, it will start the First World War. Dun, dun, dun.
That's all, folks.